Asia, where 2/3 of the world's population reside, where old meets new and tradition meets technology. 50 countries that are home to rice paddies and rickshaws, skyscrapers and sushi. I'm Roland Monhe, and this is our mission field. God has called us to reach out to multitudes, and that can only happen when we expand our leadership base. Two initiatives that have taken off recently are the Asia-Pacific School of Missions based in the Philippines and the Bangalore School of Missions established in India. These training programs are geared towards multiplying leaders, adding youthful vigor and fresh faith. We have a good blend of leadership training, academic rigor, and hands-on skills development. Mission schools directly promote mission plantings. For instance, the School of Missions in India has had 24 graduates, all primed for ministry service. In 2019, their students grabbed the opportunity to be in the mission field as they all joined in one of two plantings that year. For the Philippines, 5 new graduates were hired and now lead churches in their geographic regions. That's just in 1 year. Truly, we live in exciting times. Roughly 90% of people under 30 years of age live in emerging and developing economies. Within those categories are much of Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Myanmar, India, Pakistan, and other countries of the Indian subcontinent. The potential to reach many people, especially the youth, is virtually limitless. And speaking of youth, in the rest of this video, we'll be hearing from some next-gen leaders. Young bucks embracing leadership in line with our strategic plans for the next decade. We're thrilled to introduce them and equally grateful for the Beam Missions Foundation and all our partners who invest in the next generation.
Hello everyone, my name is Dan Kabatsan from the Asia-Pacific School of Missions here in the Philippines. I was part of the Asia Church History Project through the BMF Global Connect. This group project involved around 50 young leaders. And as we were doing our research, we had the opportunity to interview church leaders around Asia. We were able to see the church from a different perspective. We saw how they started from a small group of brave, faithful disciples to the churches they are now. And like all other churches, it wasn't all about just the blessings, the fun times, and the good times. Each church experienced challenges and hardship as the years went by. In some countries, local government authorities resulted in disciples holding services underground. Some Christians were heavily persecuted to the point of getting beaten up or even sent to prison. Our report has 3 parts: the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. I specifically was part of the 2000s to present. And as with most churches around the world, we went through a crisis following 2003. This involved the Henry Crete letter, needed reforms, and various leadership changes. Churches throughout Asia struggled. There was a lot of confusion and a lot of disagreement. Despite all this, I saw how the Holy Spirit helped the churches mature, hold on to the truth, and fight for their faith. Overall, seeing the last 5 decades, this is what impacted me the most. Hearing leaders share their stories and seeing how they stayed faithful throughout these years inspired me to do the same. Can I be as faithful as these leaders? Or as faithful as these disciples who stayed for so many years and will stay till the very last breath? Their stories demonstrate true discipleship. It ignited a fire within me and convicted me to stay faithful till the very end. That's my introduction, so here's what we've learned.
Asia had a population of 2.6 billion people in the beginning of 1980. It is some of the most populated countries in the world: China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This continent also had the vast majority of its population practicing Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. The 1980s was an exciting time for the ICOC churches. During the same decade of the Tiananmen Square massacre and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Holy Spirit was leading mission work in the Asian continent through the vision and inspiration of leaders like Scott and Lynn Green, Frank and Erica Kim, Kip and Elena McKean, and Douglas and Joyce Arthur, who inspired many mission teams to be sent out to evangelize Asia. God's Spirit was moving powerfully, using missionaries mainly from the USA and UK to spread the aroma of Christ throughout these countries in Asia. These missionaries were disciples who left their Western dreams, who were willing to give up everything, go anywhere, and do anything to see the world turned upside down for Jesus. God's Spirit worked powerfully through them. The first church planted in India was in Bombay, now known as Mumbai, in 1986. The first mission team of 11 disciples arrived from Boston, led by Jim and Donna Blow, along with Greg and Shelley Mutton. They took the one suitcase challenge and left their jobs, sold their homes and businesses, and brought their young children with them to preach the gospel, just carrying their one suitcase of personal belongings. In just a year, God blessed the church with 57 baptisms. In 1988, another mission team from London landed in Bangalore. This was led by Mark and Nadine Templer, along with Mohan Nanjandan. The team were called the Bangaluis because of their radical faith and spirited evangelism. This young church witnessed 129 souls being saved in their first year. Despite the many challenges that the disciples faced, sickness, persecution, police interrogations, danger, lack of funds, and language barriers, God was with them, and the Holy Spirit led them to plant more churches in key cities. So, in 1989, New Delhi and Chennai were planted.
In September 1987, the church in Boston sent 17 disciples to Hong Kong, joining the 5 disciples who were already there. The team was led by Scott and Lynn Green, along with Steve and Jane Chin. Being foreigners was quite an advantage. The locals were naturally drawn to disciples and made reaching out to people less challenging. However, a big hurdle for the whole team was the language. Most of the mission team members could speak Mandarin, but the local language in Hong Kong was Cantonese. The difference in language made it difficult to communicate with the people they were trying to share the gospel with. Even so, the disciples helped save 4 souls in their first year, and with firm determination, zeal, and passion for God, most of the mission members learned the local language and started to study the Bible in Cantonese. Indeed, their efforts were not in vain. From 20 or so disciples, they baptized more than 280 souls over the next 2 years. Then in the year 1988, a mission team from London arrived in Singapore. It was led by John and Karen Lewis, and when the church conducted its first official worship service, they saw almost 200 people in attendance. The following year, during their first anniversary service at the Singapore Conference Hall, they had over 1,000 in attendance. By the end of that year, the church had 350 members. In 4 years' time, the church membership had grown and reached to 700. But persecution ensued. Soon after, there was a defamation case against the church. The disciples stood strong through this challenge, and God's hand helped the church to win the case eventually.
In 1986, seasoned visionaries George and Irene Garganos formed a team to spearhead the pre-planting of ICOC Tokyo. 2 years later, Frank and Erica Kim came together with radical disciples from the San Francisco church. The church started small but saw unprecedented growth in the years that followed. ICOC Philippines was planted in the year 1989 by 28 disciples. The mission team, composed mostly of Filipino-American disciples, landed in Manila under the leadership of Preston and Sandy Shepherd, together with Anthony and Songa Lang. They sacrificed their careers, homes, and the American dream to help realize God's dream of making disciples in the Philippines. The first church service in Manila witnessed an attendance of 216. Amazingly, within a Filipino culture steeped in traditional religion and superstition, the church saw 400 souls being saved in their first year. Within the next years, many more churches would be planted throughout the archipelago. The San Francisco Church sent a mission team to Seoul, South Korea in June 1989. They were led by Tom and Denise Snyder. In the years to follow, Korean disciples planted 5 other churches in Daegu, Busan, and Daejeon. Korean disciples were also sent to help out younger churches in Japan, Myanmar, and Thailand.
The Asian continent grew to a population of 3.2 billion people beginning 1990. The Holy Spirit's work in Asia witnessed rapid growth during the 90s, as we saw the planting of ICOC churches in most of the countries in Asia. This decade saw more churches in countries being led by nationals, as the missionaries who came focused on training and raising up local men and women to lead churches in their own countries. In the 1990s, the Tokyo Church grew to over 1,000 disciples under Frank and Erica Kim's leadership. This was truly amazing, as Japan is considered to be the Mount Everest of missions, arguably the toughest mission field in the world. The church grew despite many obstacles amidst strong cultural and religious traditions and persecutions. Same way, in 1990, the Osaka church was planted. The following year, Takeshi Yamazaki was appointed first Japanese evangelist. In the mid-90s, Nagoya and Fukuoka churches were planted. Also, at a time when most churches didn't own facilities, the Tokyo Church built their own church building in the heart of the capital, which was later acclaimed as an architectural masterpiece. Churches in mainland China and Taiwan were started in the 1990s through the faith and efforts of the Hong Kong Church. Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia was also planted in 1995. All the churches in mainland China were underground churches. These churches faced many challenges. Some missionaries had to leave the country. Disciples could not meet publicly or carry Bibles and pray openly. They had to share their faith discreetly, as they could get caught by the government and be severely punished. In spite of these hardships, the churches flourished and spread.
So despite poverty and persecution from religious extremists and families, the number of disciples grew rapidly. The 90s saw more church planting in many new cities in India, also extending to the nations of Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Pakistan. One of the convictions that the leaders passed on was that we should, as disciples, reach out to and help the poor in every city where we start a church. This would prove to have a great impact on the church and the cities we lived in. Hope was set up under the guidance of the Templars and Arthurs as well as Bob and Pat Gamble. The Village of Hope project in Delhi saw the building of 800 homes for people suffering from leprosy. Orphanages and many outreach programs were established to reach out to the most needy. In 1996, when Mark and Nadine Templar left to serve UK churches, Dinesh and Caroline George were called to lead the Indian churches. By this time, virtually all of the churches in South Asia were led by nationals. In the 1990s, Singapore Church sent out churches to be planted in the Southeast Asian countries. A church was planted in Jakarta, Indonesia in 1990, led by singles, and in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in 1991. This was a bold and courageous effort as both these countries are Muslim nations. Each of these churches sent out mission teams to major cities in their countries, and the churches grew greatly in number, inspiring mission work throughout the movement. Many nationals were raised up to lead churches like Vincent and Jane Sim in Malaysia and Harlan and Wania Salim in Indonesia. The Phnom Penh Church was planted in 1992 amidst political strife and killings. The Sihanouk Hospital Center of Hope was built in 1996, treating thousands of patients free of charge. The government and even King Norodom Sihanouk of Cambodia lauded the hospital. Through this effort, many medical professionals became disciples. The hospital continues to shine the light of Christ upon a nation that was ravaged by the Khmer Rouge, serving 1.4 million patients to date. Sowan and Sophie Seng continue to lead the charge in Cambodia. The Manila Church grew rapidly during the 1990s, being the fastest growing ICOC church in Asia. In 1994, the historic One Generation World Leadership Conference in Asian Jubilee were held in Manila. Hope Worldwide started many new projects throughout the country during this period, including one at the famous Smoky Mountain garbage dump. Hope Youth Centers were established to empower Filipino youth in depressed areas. In the decade of 90s, the Philippine churches sent out 14 mission teams, and the churches grew from around 300 to 4,500 in membership. The Filipino disciples are grateful for the leaders who spearheaded this growth. The Galants, Bringardeners, Lopezes, Lust, Arcelans, and Enriles, as well as second wave missionaries who came to build up the church. The Ho Chi Minh Church was planted in 1994 by the Los Angeles Church. The mission team consisted of many who had fled their war-torn country to America to save their lives. They were willing to risk their lives and go back with a mission to make disciples. Despite being pursued by police and having no permanent place to worship, one by one, Vietnamese men and women made Jesus Lord. Amidst their trials under the leadership of Hung and Hong, they have grown to almost 300 membership across 4 churches. Recently, they were able to purchase land and construct a permanent place for worship, a proud achievement for the Vietnamese disciples.
Most of the ICOC churches in Asia were established during the decade of 1990s. God continued to work powerfully in all the nations in Asia, and the churches grew steadily. In the early 2000s, the world was shocked seeing the attack on the World Trade Center, and also an Asian tsunami killed 230,000 people. The world was grieving, so were the people of Asia. During this time, in 2003, the ICOC churches around the world were gravely affected by the Henry Creed letter. The churches in Asia had to let go of more than half of the full-time workers because of the loss of financial support of US churches. Distrust between the leadership and members arose. resulting in confusion, bitterness, anger, and also division in some churches. People's faith was hurt, and a large number of disciples left the fellowship. However, many held on. Even though we were unprepared for what happened, God used all this to bring about deeper changes in each one's heart and significant reformations in our churches. In the following years, the Holy Spirit worked to rebuild trust and reunite congregations, bringing everyone together to rebuild the churches around the world. Because of the loss of the full-time workers and external support, the local churches had to evaluate and reconstruct on many levels. For instance, the churches in the Philippines facilitated discussions among the leadership to begin the reconciliation and reorganization process. This led to establishment of a new church board in 2004, as well as the formation of congregational committees targeted to meet special needs. Every churches in every nation had to figure out ways to come together to strengthen and unify. The unity proposal was sent out to each church to recommit to global unity and to basic Bible doctrines and church practices. The leaders from churches around the world came together to address common concerns and forge cooperation. Many churches worked towards being financially self-supporting churches. As the churches started to come together, those that were hurting financially started getting supported again.
God was at work as many churches multiplied and sent out different mission plantings. Many churches started training the next generation disciples by starting various training programs, including schools of mission with the support of the Beam Fund and different mission societies, instilling in them a vision to serve God and aspire for leadership. What happened in the early 2000s was painful, but since then, we have seen God moving again in a powerful way in Asia. In the Philippines, churches have been planted in more than a dozen provincial cities since 2008. There are now 33 churches in the Asia-Pacific region with Philippines and Myanmar, close to 5,300 members. Likewise, in South Asia, all churches came together to send out mission teams to establish 40 new churches. Now there are over 7,300 disciples in South Asia in 63 cities. There are 6 churches currently in South Korea, totaling over 750 disciples. And they have a dream to plant churches in all cities. The Southeast Asian churches set up a vision to double in a dozen ways. Today, they have 64 churches in 8 countries with over 9,200 disciples. The 28 churches in the China region continue to grow, now approaching 4,000 membership. As the world navigates the COVID-19 pandemic, all our churches are adapting and learning. Disciples explored the experience of virtual worship services and conferences. Yes, we were badly affected by the pandemic. Disciples lost their jobs and businesses. Many of them even lost their lives and their loved ones. But even during lockdowns, the disciples were actively reaching out to their relatives, friends, and former members. The unity and compassion of the churches was evident as disciples around the world rose to the occasion. We helped out members who were hurting, including their neighbors. Even as disciples are embracing the new normal, God is still at work, doing exciting and amazing things all over Asia.
Tempus fugit, a Latin phrase which means time flies. It remains true for all and certainly is true for our churches in the Asian continent. A lot has happened since the first seeds were planted. in the last 3 decades, despite hardships and persecution, church problems within and without, God has been glorified. Empowered by the Holy Spirit, we have been able to plant churches in 195 cities in 19 countries with over 26,500 disciples and growing. I am proud to be part of such a movement with the goal of leading people to the truth. And by being part, I don't mean I'm only spectating, but God gave me an opportunity to be actively involved in reaching out to people, to get trained and to grow deeper in my knowledge of His Word. And what a life-changing, faith-building journey it has been for me. Tempus fugit, time flies. It has been true so far for our churches, and it will continue to be so in the coming future. The next few years and decades will also fly by. And as that happens, you and I are called to dream dreams and envision visions for God's kingdom. As time flies, you and I are called to be an active part of this movement and not just spectate. The Asian population is at 4.6 billion and growing. There are still 6 countries waiting. There are thousands of cities and millions of lost souls to reach out to. We, the current generation, are the ones chosen for this task. We are the ones chosen for such a time as this. Let us turn to the Lord of the harvest, and may He encourage our hearts and inspire us to take up this call to go and make disciples of all nations.